Imagine you are on a commercial flight. You know, you're cruising at 30,000 feet, maybe sipping a tiny cup of lukewarm coffee.
Probably scrolling through some emails you downloaded right before takeoff, right?
Yeah, exactly. Everything is just completely normal. It's routine. And then, without any warning at all, the engines cut out.
Oh, wow.
Right. The cabin goes completely silent for about half a second, and then the oxygen masks drop from the ceiling. The plane just suddenly lurches, dropping thousands of feet in a matter of seconds.
Absolute nightmare scenario.
Utter sheer panic sets in. You know, people are screaming. People who haven't prayed in 40 years are suddenly clutching their armrests and crying out like whatever higher power they can possibly think of.
Yeah, the classic foxhole reaction.
Exactly. And we look at a moment like that culturally, and we call it finding your true faith. We have this really pervasive belief that it's only in the shadow of absolute unavoidable catastrophe that a person's true self is finally unmasked.
It is a very romantic idea, isn't it? I mean, the concept that if you strip away the daily routine, the meetings, the superficial layers of society,
Yeah.
what is left beneath all that armor is supposedly the core, unvarnished truth of who a person really is.
Right, and we cling to that. It's comforting. And here's where we get into today's topic. What if I told you that according to a masterclass in ancient macro sociology, that moment of sheer terror on the airplane isn't your true self at all?
It's a huge paradigm shift.
It really is. What if that visceral, desperate pleading is actually the ultimate biological illusion? That is exactly what we are unpacking for you today. So welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today is to analyze a foundational text on civilizational survival. Specifically, we're looking at the concluding verses of Surah Al-Ankabut from verse 60 to the end. And we are looking at this through a very specific lens, which is the analytical framework of the Tolui Islam source material.
And before we get into the weeds, we should probably clarify what that framework actually is, because it completely changes how you read the text.
Oh, absolutely. Give us the baseline.
So, for those who might be unfamiliar, Tolui Islam is a school of thought that gained prominence in the 20th century. It essentially strips away centuries of ritualistic clerical dogma. It looks at the Quran not as a book of magical spells or personal spiritual hygiene, but as a blueprint for socioeconomic systems.
Right. It's a macro-sociological approach.
Exactly. So when we talk about this text today, we are not delivering a theological sermon. There's going to be zero sentimental preaching here.
Which I love, honestly, because frankly, sentimental preaching doesn't really help me understand how the world actually works.
No, it doesn't.
We're putting on our hard hats today. We are analyzing this text as sociologists, as systems engineers. We're going to look at the raw mechanics of human behavior, how we distribute resources, and, the glaring, incredibly uncomfortable difference between genuine structural alignment with reality and just paying lip service to it when things get scary.
Yeah, and that brings us right back to your airplane analogy, or as the text frames it, the foxhole faith myth. The source material brings in verse 29.65 to just completely explode the notion that a crisis reveals your true convictions.
What does the text actually say there?
It says, when they board the ship, they call upon God, sincere to him in devotion, but when he delivers them to land, at once they associate others with him.
I mean, let's just pause on that. The scenario is identical to the airplane, a sinking ship.
Yep. Same exact human reaction.
And what I find fascinating is the paradigm shift the text demands right here. It's not looking at the people preying on the sinking ship and saying, oh, look at these hypocrites. It's looking at the system.
It's a structural critique.
Exactly. It's framing this not as a personal spiritual failing, but as a systemic structural failure of how they operate their lives.
Because we have to define what a conviction actually is. I mean, a conviction that only materializes when you are teetering on the edge of the abyss and then completely evaporates the second your boots touch dry land that is not a conviction.
Okay, but let me push back here for a second. Let me play devil's advocate, because I think a lot of people listening, maybe you're commuting to work right now, you might think, well, hold on, panic is a real emotion.
Sure, panic is very real.
Right, so doesn't that panic point to some deep buried truth? Like at least they know who to call when the chips are truly down? Isn't that acknowledging the truth?
That's the trap, actually.
Yeah.
It feels like truth because the biological response is so overwhelming. But panic is not an operating system.
Okay, unpack that. Panic is not an operating system.
Right, it is a biological survival reflex firing on all cylinders. This text is serving as an X-ray. It's exposing this vast, gaping canyon between situational pleading, which is what you do on the sinking ship, and real steady-state alignment.
Which is what you do on dry land.
Exactly, which is what you do when you have 1,000 options on dry land. If your alignment with the universal operating system only functions when the metaphorical ship is sinking, you don't actually possess an operating system.
You just possess a panic button.
You just possess a panic button. That's all it is.
Man, that's a brutal diagnosis. So the people on the ship, they hit the panic button, they survive, and then they completely revert.
You go right back to their old ways.
To understand why that sinking ship reaction is functionally useless to building a civilization, we need to do a linguistic deep dive into the terminology here, right?
Yeah, we have to look at the original Arabic. The contrast the text uses is incredibly sharp. Let's look at how it describes human behavior under terminal stress versus human behavior in comfort.
Let's start with the state on the ship. What's the phrase?
The Arabic phrase used is mukhlisina lahu al-din. Let's break that down, because the standard translations often just say sincere in religion, which completely misses the sociological weight.
Right, because religion sounds like a private internal feeling.
Exactly. Din here doesn't mean a private set of beliefs you hold in your heart. In this context, din implies a comprehensive system of life. It's a way of operating an economic and social order.
So it's systemic.
Highly systemic. So, mukhlisina lahu al-din translates roughly to being sincere to him in the system or sincere in the overarching way.
Okay, so under terminal stress, what happens to their normal way of operating?
It shatters, completely shatters. All the artificial lifelines we build on land, the societal hierarchies, the fabricated dependencies, the economic safety nets, they all drop away.
Because none of it matters when you're drowning.
Right, because when the hull of the ship is breached and the ocean is pouring in, water physics does not care about your stock portfolio.
Yeah, your social status cannot patch a hole in a boat.
It reminds me of the title of the surah itself, actually, Al-Ankabut.
The spider.
Yes, it's the metaphor of the spider's web. The web is highly intricate. It takes a lot of effort to build. It looks very impressive. But the moment a strong wind blows, or in this case, a storm hits the ship, it is instantly obliterated.
So the fragile web of human fictions is forgotten when the ship goes down.
The idolater, which in this macro-sociological framework means the person who spends their life relying on these fragile human power structures, suddenly reverts to the one real foundational principle of the universe.
Because they have no other choice. They realize their artificial systems are void.
So they align, momentarily, with the ultimate source of reality.
But then the storm passes. The ship limps into the harbor. The sun comes out. They step onto dry land. And the text says they do what?
The text says, yushrikun. They associate partners.
Okay, now let's translate that out of the theological jargon. What does associating partners mean in a sociological dry land context?
It means comfort restores the fiction.
Comfort restores the fiction. What?
The moment the immediate threat to their biological survival is removed, humans almost reflexively return to their fabricated systems. Associating partners means they go back to relying on and serving the artificial power structures, the economic hoarding mechanisms, the political hierarchies that they had completely abandoned when the ship was going down.
They divide their loyalties among a dozen different human-made systems that demand their subservience.
Exactly. It is a profound cognitive dissonance. It's almost schizophrenic.
It really is, and the text doesn't let them off the hook at all. It points to the surrounding verses, specifically verses 61 to 63, to highlight just how absurd this behavior actually is.
Right, it interrogates them.
Yeah, it poses a series of interrogations to these exact same people who just survived the storm. It asks, who created the heavens and earth? Who subjected the sun and the moon to their orbits? Who sends down water from the sky to revive the dead land?
And look at the answer given by these people. The text says, they will say, God.
They just admit it.
They readily, easily concede the real, ultimate source of the productive cosmos. They acknowledge the engine of reality. They admit the physics of the universe.
Exactly. They say, yes, we agree there is a flawless, life-giving macro system running the universe. But then their socioeconomic actions on dry land completely and utterly contradict this concession.
It's a total disconnect.
They acknowledge the absolute power that runs the universe, but then they build a society based on fear, artificial scarcity, and subservience to human-made fictions.
They admit the macro system works perfectly, but they absolutely refuse to model their society after it.
Okay, I have to bring up the analogy from the source material here because it answers that pushback I had earlier about isn't acknowledging the truth enough.
Oh, the sun analogy, that's a great one.
It's brilliant. The source material uses this analogy about the sun. So if you are listening to this on a walk right now, imagine standing outside at noon. The sun is blazing. Now, squeeze your eyes tightly shut.
Okay.
The sun is still there, obviously.
Yeah.
Its reality is not dependent on your observation of it.
Right. The macro system exists regardless of your participation.
Now imagine you walk around with your eyes squeezed shut, bumping into walls, tripping over curbs, falling into ditches, but the whole time you are shouting at the top of your lungs, "I believe in the sun. I acknowledge that the sun exists."
Which is technically true.
But what is the value of that statement?
It is factually true, but operationally void.
Yes, operationally void. Saying, "I believe in the sun" is completely meaningless if you refuse to open your eyes and use its light to actually navigate your environment.
The acknowledgement does absolutely nothing to stop you from falling into the ditch.
It's like a corporate executive who has a perfectly engineered safety manual, but he only ever opens it and follows the protocols when the factory floor is actively engulfed in flames.
Just running around in a panic.
Right. During normal daily operations, he ignores every single rule, causing endless accidents, injuries, and inefficiencies. You wouldn't look at that executive and say, wow, he has a really great safety system.
You'd say, no, he just knows how to panic when the building is collapsing.
Surviving a disaster is not the same thing as operating a functional system.
That analogy perfectly synthesizes the text's core argument. The real system is conceded under the pressure of honest questioning or under the pressure of a sinking ship, but it is completely abandoned the moment comfort returns.
And this brings us to the core engine of reason in the text, right?
It does. And arguably, it's the most devastating critique of human economics we're going to talk about today.
Because it forces the logical next question. If humans concede the ultimate operating system of the universe, but they abandon it the moment they hit dry land, what exactly are they replacing it with?
Nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. If they aren't using the real system to run their societies, what is the fiction of the dry land they are so eager to return to?
The text frames this as the tyranny of unproven assertions. Look at verse 29.60. The rational closure of the argument is brilliant because the deniers essentially convict themselves out of their own mouths.
How so?
Well, as we just noted, they admit the universe is run by a productive, perfect, life-giving order sending water, reviving dead land. The macro system is flawless and provides abundantly.
Right.
Yet in their microsystem, their socioeconomic reality, they serve human-made fictions that produce absolutely nothing of real value.
Okay, let's make this concrete for the listener. What is the foundational fiction? Like, if we peel back the layers of our modern dryland systems, what is the root code of this corrupted economic operating system?
According to the analysis in the Tului Islam framework, the ultimate fiction, the root virus in the code, is the fear of starvation.
Fear of starvation.
It is the anxiety of future lack. It is the belief that the universe will not provide for me tomorrow, therefore I must secure my own survival at all costs today.
Even at the expense of others.
Always at the expense of others. This fear creates the false economic system of hoarding, which inevitably, mathematically, results in class disparity and systemic injustice.
This is where the source text gets incredibly sociological and frankly a bit uncomfortable for modern listeners.
Because it hits close to home.
Very close. It asks us to look at the natural order as a baseline. Take a look at the animal kingdom. The text uses the example of livestock. Think about a cow in a pasture.
Yep.
That cow eats according to its biological need. It grazes, it gets full, it rests, it digests.
And what does the cow not do? The cow does not uproot an entire acre of grass, strap a massive towering sack of it to its back, and carry it around for the next 10 years, just in case there is a drought in 2035.
Right. Because that would be insane.
It would be pathological. The natural system provides a continuous flow of sustenance. The cow operates in structural alignment with that flow, taking exactly what is required for the present moment and trusting the system for the next.
But humans supposedly the pinnacle of intellect, we disconnect from this natural distribution model entirely.
I think we can do it better.
We do. And the source material points out that humans invented a workaround: currency. Now, initially, we can agree this was just to solve a practical problem of barter. Like, if I have surplus wheat and you have surplus oil and we want to trade, that's fine.
Sure, makes sense.
But there's a catch with physical goods. Wheat rots, oil goes rancid.
Right, there is a natural thermodynamic limit to how much physical sustenance one human can realistically hoard before nature reclaims it.
Nature has a built-in cap.
Exactly. If you try to hoard 10 lifetimes worth of apples, they will just turn to compost. Nature enforces a cap on hoarding.
But a coin does not rot. A digital zero in a book account does not decay.
It's eternal in a sense.
Currency abstracted the value of the wheat and the oil into a non-perishable medium. And while that is a brilliant tool for exchange, we obviously need money to operate a complex global society. What's fascinating here is how it mutated into a tool for pathological accumulation.
Because the medium doesn't decay, the natural cap is completely removed. You can now hoard an infinite amount of it.
Infinite.
You can accumulate value far, far beyond your biological needs, beyond your generational needs. You can hoard 1,000 lifetimes of resources.
You can have 1 billion coins while the person standing right next to you has 0.
And this creates an artificial shortage.
Wait, expand on that. Why artificial?
Because the overarching macro system of the universe, the Earth itself, provides enough for everyone's need. The calories exist. The water exists.
The actual physical stuff is there.
Right. But the fictional human system on dry land creates a bizarre scenario where one person has millions of abstract markers of wealth and another person starves to death outside their gated community.
And it is all driven by that initial fiction, that unproven assertion, the fear that the universe's system is flawed, that it will not provide, so I must artificially secure my own survival at the expense of the larger community.
It is a complete operational rejection of the macro system they just admitted they believed in when they were on the sinking ship.
That's the tragic irony.
On the ship, they trusted the ultimate reality. On land, they trust the hoarded coin.
Okay, so if we establish that hoarding out of fear is a systemic failure, the next logical question is, what does that actually do to a civilization over time? Does the text address the psychological toll of building a society this way?
It does, and the verdict is pretty harsh.
What's the verdict on a life lived like this?
Verse 29.64 delivers a brutal surgical assessment. It calls this life, this pursuit of endless accumulation, la walib, diversion and play.
Diversion and play, it sounds almost dismissive.
It's a profound critique of our seriousness as a species. It is saying that a life lived entirely for the accumulation of surplus agents. A socio-economic system where the acquisition of the abstract medium becomes the absolute end goal is fundamentally unserious.
It's a game.
It is an illusion. It is a distraction from the actual purpose of civilizational development. The text contrasts this with Lahi al-Hayawan, the real, continuous life, the steady-state reality.
I want to dive into the horse analogy the source provides here because it really crystallizes this concept of law of diversion. It makes it so tangible.
It's one of the best analogies for this.
Think about the listener driving their car right now. Imagine you have a massive, important journey to take across the country. To get there, you need a vehicle. Let's use the old school example from the text. You buy a horse. The horse is your tool.
Right.
Now, to use that tool, you have to maintain it. You must feed it. You must brush it. You must build a stable to protect it from the winter weather. All of that is necessary, logical maintenance.
The maintenance of the tool is required to utilize the tool. No one is arguing against basic economics or taking care of your resources.
Exactly. Nobody is saying, let the horse starve. But what happens if you get so obsessed with the horse that you forget the journey entirely?
That's where the diversion happens.
You spend your entire life just brushing the horse day and night. You build it an incredibly opulent, gold-plated stable with climate control. You just sit there in the stable, staring at the horse, accumulating more and more expensive grooming tools for it, comparing your horse to your neighbor's horse.
But you never actually saddle it up and ride it anywhere.
Never. You have turned the vehicle into the final destination. You have completely lost the plot. That is law.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The tools of this world, the economy, the technology, the infrastructure, the currency, they are the horse.
They're just vehicles.
They are meant to be utilized as vehicles to reach a higher civilizational goal, to align human society with that continuous real life, the Hayawan, where humanity reaches its full potential.
But when a civilization becomes obsessed with just accumulating the tools, when GDP becomes the only metric of success rather than the actual well-being, education, and structural alignment of the citizens, they are just brushing the horse.
They are engaged in diversion and play. They are playing a massive global game of Monopoly, entirely missing the actual objective of existence.
And the tragic irony is the more time they spend hoarding the feed for the horse, the more anxious they become about losing it.
Right. The anxiety just compounds.
Okay, but I need to stop you here because I think we've thoroughly diagnosed the disease. We understand the false system of the dry land. It's static, it's based on hoarding, fear, and stagnation.
Yes, the diagnosis is clear.
But what does the cure look like? What does the tree system look like? How does a modern civilization actually align its daily dryland operations with the permanent laws of the universe?
This is where we have to look at the mechanics of the true system.
And this brings us to arguably the most fascinating paradigm-shifting concept in this entire deep dive: the contrast in the source material between the flowing spring and the stagnant pond.
This is a massive structural pivot in our understanding. To grasp this, we have to completely deconstruct the concept of Sharia.
Let's do it, because that word carries a lot of baggage.
Oh, an immense amount of baggage. In common parlance today, when people hear that word, whether in Western media or even in traditionalist circles, they think of a rigid, immutable, monolithic set of penal codes codified 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, the perception is a legalistic straitjacket, a set of rules frozen in time.
Exactly. But the Toli Islam source material takes us back to the raw linguistic roots of the Arabic word itself. Etymologically, Sharia does not mean a static law.
What did it mean originally?
In the desert culture where the language originated, the word originally described a path, specifically a path that leads directly to a flowing, continuous spring of fresh water, a watering hole that sustains life.
A path to water. That implies movement. It implies a destination that is actively, continuously providing sustenance.
Crucially, it implies flow. And this is the genius of the metaphor. If you follow a path to a spring, and you arrive to find that the water has stopped flowing, that it has been dammed up, and what is left is just a fetid, stagnant pond breeding mosquitoes and disease, the word Sharia no longer applies to that path.
Wow.
Linguistically, it ceases to be Sharia. By definition, a true system must be in continuous motion. It must be dynamic.
Because if the water isn't moving, it's dead.
Right. It must possess the capacity to address the shifting, evolving demands of human civilization across completely different eras, geographies, and technological landscapes.
I want to camp out on this for a second because it's so important. Why do human societies prefer stagnant ponds? If a flowing spring is the ideal, why do we constantly dam it up?
It goes back to fear and control.
Always comes back to fear.
A flowing river is unpredictable. It requires you to build a boat, to learn to navigate, to constantly adapt to the current. It requires active, daily engagement.
In a stagnant pond.
A stagnant pond, on the other hand, is safe. It's predictable. More importantly, from a sociological standpoint, you can build a fence around a stagnant pond.
Oh, I see where this is going.
You can put a gate on it. You can put a cleric or a politician at the gate and charge people admission to access the dirty water. You can't control a flowing river that easily. The stagnant pond is the ultimate tool for human power structures to maintain authority.
Wow. That makes so much sense. We freeze the system because the frozen system is easier to monopolize.
Precisely.
But if the water isn't fresh, it's not the path to the spring anymore, it's just a path to a swamp. This concept completely shatters the idea that structural alignment means freezing society in amber in the 7th century or the 18th century or whatever golden age a culture reveres.
The text explicitly notes that the ultimate law, the universal operating system, has a new manifestation every single moment. The source says God is in a new state every day.
A new state every day, so constant change.
The universe is not a static diorama. It is a continuously expanding, highly active environment. Therefore, any socioeconomic system claiming to align with the universe must also be dynamic and adaptive.
Okay, but this sounds chaotic. If everything is always changing, how do we have any stability? How do we know what the rules are?
That's the tension, yeah.
This brings us to the interplay between the permanent and the adaptable. The text uses two distinct terms to balance this, doesn't it? Sirat al-Mustaqim and Subul.
Right, let's define those. Sirat al-Mustaqim is the permanent direction. It is the unwavering, overarching goal. Subul are the multiple changing paths or ways that lead toward that direction.
I think about it in modern civil engineering terms. Think of the core principles, the Sirat al-Mustaqim, as the main continental superhighway. It is fixed, it is flawless, the direction is absolute. It is the permanent law of universal alignment, the steady-state reality where humanity is meant to travel.
The permanent destination is set. Human dignity, equitable resource distribution, justices, those don't change.
But human civilization is constantly moving. We aren't starting our journey from the same place our ancestors did. So the subul, the paths, the ways are the on-ramps to that highway.
I like that, the on-ramps.
You need dozens, hundreds of different on-ramps depending on where you are starting from geographically and temporally.
Exactly. If you are a society in the agrarian age, your on-ramp to justice and equity looks one way. If you're in the Industrial Revolution, it looks entirely different.
And if you are in the era of artificial intelligence, globalized supply chains, algorithmic trading, and quantum computing,
Yeah.
you need a radically different on-ramp to get onto that exact same highway of equity and justice.
You can't use an ox cart ramp for a modern vehicle.
Right. A system that refuses to build new on-ramps, a system that insists you have to walk back 1,000 miles in the dark to use the on-ramp built in the Middle Ages, is worse than useless. It actively abandons the people left behind in the modern city. The highway remains permanent, but the subble must be continuously engineered by every new generation.
Let's make this real. Let's spend a few minutes debating what a modern on-ramp or a modern flowing spring actually looks like today. Because if we just talk about this abstractly, we are guilty of the same unproven assertions that text critiques.
Fair point.
If hoarding via abstract currency is the stagnant pond, how do we engineer a flowing spring in the 21st century?
Okay, let's open that up. If the goal is to prevent the pathological hoarding we discussed earlier, what is the subble? Is it something like universal basic income, where the floor of survival is guaranteed so the fear of starvation, the root virus, is eradicated?
UBI is definitely one proposed modern on-ramp. If you remove the existential terror of zero, perhaps humans stop over-accumulating out of panic. But you could also argue from this framework that UBI is just a patch on a broken system.
Right, he doesn't fix the hoarding at the top.
Exactly. Some might say a truer symbol would be structural wealth caps, a mathematically enforced limit on how much of the abstract medium one entity can hoard before it must be recirculated back into the flowing spring of the economy.
A maximum wage, essentially, or 100% tax over a certain billion-dollar threshold.
Yeah.
I can hear people yelling at us right now. That stifles innovation.
Of course they'd say that.
But if we stick to the text's framework, innovation for what? If the innovation is just building a fancier stable for the horse while the rest of the town starves, the text calls that law diversion.
Exactly. And just to be clear, we aren't taking a political side here. We are applying the sociological stress test of the source text.
We're just looking at the mechanics.
Right. Another modern on-ramp might be open source technology. Think about it. Proprietary, walled-off technology is a stagnant pond. You hoard the intellectual property to extract rent from it. Open source development, where the code flows freely and anyone can draw from it to build and improve society, operates much closer to the linguistic definition of a flowing spring.
That's a brilliant connection, the flow of information as a modern spring. But this raises an incredibly important question.
Which is,
If we are tasked with constantly engineering these new on-ramps, whether it's UBI or open source tech or new economic models, how do we know we're building them in the right direction? We could easily build an on-ramp that leads right off a cliff. How do we verify our engineering?
this brings us to the culminating principle of the Surah, the fail-safe mechanism, what the source calls the law of requital, or mukafat amal.
Verse 29.69, the very end of the text. It says, "Those who strive in us jahadu fina, we will surely guide them to our way subilana, and God is with the doers of good al-musinin."
Let's analyze the mechanics of this verse, because it completely reframes how human beings acquire truth. This is not a description of a magical grant from the sky.
It's not a lightning bolt of inspiration.
No, it is a generative, self-reinforcing behavioral cycle. The guidance to find the right stable, the right on-ramps, is not passively received. It is actively earned.
The text uses the word jahadu.
Yes, from the root of jihad, which fundamentally means exerting maximum sustained effort, struggling against resistance. Guidance is the output of striving. It is never granted to the passive observer who is just sitting by the stagnant pond waiting for a sudden revelation.
I used an analogy in my notes earlier about machine learning algorithms, but let's scrap that because it's a bit cold. Let's use a deeply human analogy. Think about the law of requital, like muscle hypertrophy in physical fitness.
Okay, walk me through that.
If you want to get stronger, you cannot just read a book about deadlifts. You can't sit on the couch and passionately believe in the concept of a barbell.
That won't do anything for your muscles.
Exactly. The biological system of your body will only adapt. It will only build new muscle tissue and give you the guidance of strength when it is placed under sustained, active, mechanical stress. You have to go to the gym, pick up the heavy weight, and physically struggle against gravity. The tension is what triggers the adaptation.
That is exactly the mechanism described here.
Right. You can't pray for muscles. You have to earn them through the law of physical requital. The system only provides the output of strength when you provide the input of sustained effort. The universe works the exact same way with civilizational guidance.
The socioeconomic muscle.
Yes, you don't get the blueprint for a perfect society by waiting around. You have to feed the system active, honest, sustained effort. You have to try to build the on-ramps. You will fail, you will iterate, but the more high-quality effort you input, the more the system refines your trajectory.
Guidance is an output.
Guidance isn't a gift wrapped in a bow. Guidance is the physiological output of your civilizational striving. If you stop striving, the system stops adapting and you atrophy, you stagnate.
The law of requital dictates that action generates reaction. Honest effort toward understanding and aligning with the true principle is met by an increase in clarity and direction. And what is so beautiful from a literary and structural standpoint is how this perfectly brackets the entire surah.
How so? Connect the beginning to the end for us.
Think about where this specific text, Surah Al-Ankabut, began. The very first verses. It begins with a declaration. Do people think they will be left alone because they say, "We believe," and will not be tested?
Wow.
It starts with the absolute necessity of the stress test. It begins by saying that merely claiming alignment is mathematically insufficient. The system will put you under tension to reveal the reality of your claim.
Like the weight on the barbell.
Exactly. And then, after traversing all of this, the failures of situational panic on the sinking ship, the fictions of economic hoarding on dry land, the necessity of dynamic adaptation, and flowing springs, it ends precisely here. Effort yields guidance.
The universe only reveals its operating manual to those who are actively in the workshop getting their hands dirty trying to build the system.
It does not reveal its secrets to those who are passively waiting for the finished product to be delivered to their doorstep.
The test reveals who is real, and the law of the universe rewards systemic effort, not momentary panic.
That's the core thesis right there.
Okay, let's synthesize this monumental journey we've just taken through the text. We have looked at the permanent versus the changing.
The permanent principle of the universe, according to this macro-sociological analysis, is that real alignment is a steady state condition. It is a continuous operational reality built through sustained, difficult effort.
It is not the foxhole reflex.
It is not the sudden burst of clarity you get when the plane is dropping out of the sky, only to be completely forgotten the moment you are at the baggage claim complaining about a lost suitcase.
Yeah.
Striving toward the true order is met with guidance, while the faith born only of comfort inevitably collapses back into the fragile fictions of the spider's web.
And the change is that the context is always evolving. The ships and the shores differ across eras. Today, our ships might not be wooden vessels in a maritime storm.
They're very different.
Our ships are the fragile architectures of our digital economies. They are the vulnerabilities of our just-in-time global supply chains. They are the existential risks of unaligned AI and climate collapse. The storms look vastly different today, and the dry land looks different.
But the underlying human behavioral gap remains exactly the same. The chasm between situational pleading when the stock market crashes and tested structural conviction when the market is booming, that is a constant of human condition.
It really is.
That is the hurdle that every generation must continuously overcome by building new on-ramps.
It all comes full circle. Al-Ankabut, the spider, ends exactly where it began. The web is fragile, the ultimate reality is solid. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to pull you, the listener, right back into the center of this thought experiment.
Yeah, let's bring it home.
Think about your own life, your own work, your own bank account. We all face storms. We all have moments where the ship feels like it's going down, whether it's a personal health scare, a massive career failure, or a global systemic shock. The next time you face a massive crisis, ask yourself a hard, uncomfortable question.
It's the only question that matters.
When the storm finally passes, when the water recedes, the engines restart, and your ship finally hits dry land, will you actually integrate the ultimate reality you saw so clearly in the dark into your daily operations? Will you change how you build your life? Or will you just go right back to the stable, pick up the brush, and start spinning a brand new spider's web? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep striving, keep building those on-ramps, and we will see you next time.